What's happening, guys? My name's Austin, and thanks for tuning in. Now, in this special episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Mr. Duncan Murray, our new head of impact here at DevvE's. Duncan has had a very accomplished career in the city of London and comes to us with a wealth of background and nuanced understanding of the carbon markets and the overall ESG investing space. Now, in this interview, we dive into Duncan's background, the unique experience that he brings to bear at DevvE's, as well as his vision for the future. Now, we also discuss the issues plaguing the carbon markets like greenwashing and explain how the unique solution offered by DevvE's has the potential to turn this critical industry into an environmental powerhouse of efficiency and value alignment. We also really get down to the nitty-gritty on why this is such an essential venture for enterprises and nation states. Now, due to time constraints, this episode had to be shot in 2 parts, so you're going to see a background and a wardrobe change halfway through. I'd encourage everyone to watch all the way through, and I know that you'll walk away with more of an understanding and a holistic view of exactly where DevvE's stands and its work in this vital industry. Enjoy the show. What's happening, guys? Austin here, and it is my great pleasure to be sitting down with Mr. Duncan Murray today, the head of impact here at DevvE's. And Duncan, your entrance into the DevvE's ecosystem caused quite a stir recently. People were very excited to see you joining our ranks. And so if you could just introduce yourself, tell us, what is a head of impact exactly? Let's dive into that maybe.
Yeah, well, I can give you a full sort of introduction later on, but head of impact is a term we came up with. It's not necessarily a standard term for everyone in my position. Some people go for chief sustainability officer, head of climate solutions, but we wanted to keep it broader because we can offer a number of different impacts outside of the environmental space, not just on the carbon side, but also impact assets. And they can range from environmental, but also social. So, we are working to link all of these impacts, for example, with resilient digital infrastructure. So such things as digital healthcare, identification, and so on. So we're working to thread all of those together into one platform. And that's where the sort of head of impact title came from.
Excellent. And so, all right, so pulling on that thread a little bit, can we go back? Because I know, and I know you know this because you told me this before you even introed yourself, that nobody seems to get past the BlackRock occupation. And so can we talk about your background and your history a little bit before moving into DevvE's, just to kind of lay a baseline for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have worked at BlackRock, and I've been a senior manager there. I was the head of the largest shareholding reporting team in the world, and we made over 20,000 equity disclosures a year. It was by far the biggest of any financial institution. I've worked for other large financial institutions as well. Latterly, Prudential, which is one of the largest UK financial institutions, about $1 trillion under management. So I've learned, I had a corporate career, shall we say, in the city, and there I've learned various aspects of how to deal with large corporations. When I was in Prudential, for example, I oversaw teams in around 13 jurisdictions, around 30 different teams, and multifunctional teams. So they were in risk, compliance, investment, and so on. So I've had a career in the city, but also on the side of that, I've been working very much in the charity and environmental space. So since about 2017, when I set up Dust Aid, which was a charity to give away cryptocurrency dust in partnership with Coinbase. In fact, we were the first charity to partner with Coinbase. I've been working to use technology for good. And ever since then, people have come up with new improvements on the original chains, which were obviously Bitcoin, and then Ethereum was the next best one. But I've been looking to ways to create that impact and those assets on a chain or a platform that offers the technology to do it. So that's my background, and that's why I've chosen DevvE's, because I feel that we now have the technology to enable us to do that.
What a perfect fit. And for anyone that doesn't know, if you ever get the chance to talk to Duncan, he will blow your mind about his crypto understanding and knowledge. He probably has more than I do. How long have you actually been in this, like in or around this industry?
I think, like many, I dismissed it initially when I was told about it first in 2014. which was a mistake, obviously, from a buying Bitcoin point of view, because I was told about it very, very early on. But I was actually at BlackRock at that time. I was under a lot of pressure, with my work. And I didn't really, being honest, I didn't really look into it much. And then as soon as I looked into it properly in 2016, I never turned back. I was blown away by the tech. People really dwell on Bitcoin as a chain, sometimes negatively from the environmental point of view, but also the technology, and in terms of the power it consumes and the limited, or sometimes limited functionality on speed and cost. But the actual technology that underpinned Bitcoin should blow everyone away. It is absolutely groundbreaking, and as we'll talk about later on, can absolutely cause a shift in many, many industries. So I've been in and around it since about 2016, properly since 2017, working for a number of projects, advising some, as I said, partnering with the likes of Coinbase along the way with various impact projects. So I've seen the good and the bad, shall we say, of the space, the ups and downs, the cycles, what the expectations are sometimes, rightly and wrongly, what chains have claimed to do and then not done. TPS is a good example of something that lots of chains have claimed. In fact, 2017, there was one claiming they could do 1 million TPS. And they in fact called it blockchain 4.0. I wasn't even aware there was a blockchain 2 or 3 at that point, but they called it blockchain 4. So lots of people have made claims. Everyone knows history of various stages, such as the ICO, DeFi summer, both of which were crazy times. And now we're, I think everyone's, working on the assumption we're at the cusp of another of those, quote unquote, crazy times where the narratives have shifted more towards RWAs and AI. Last time it was DeFi. Gaming's been floating around to a couple. Initially it was ICOs and STOs. And they all come and go. Obviously we've had the NFT boom in between. But fundamentally, the technology behind all of these narratives is great, and I love being part of it. And I have picked up bits and pieces of knowledge along the way.
Well, I'm really curious. So, in all of your experience, in the financial world, working in London, in crypto, you have a very intimate knowledge, it seems, of the carbon markets, of impact assets, and the way that seems to function. Where does that experience come from?
So that experience comes from my time in Web3, since Web3. So working for climate projects, working for other chains that are making or attempting to make a difference, and working out. My biggest passion has always been around the gamification of climate assets. Why not have real life animals in games, landscapes in games? Why not connect your activity in a game to the real world via assets? People, I read about 6 months ago that someone paid $15,000 for a sword in Warcraft. That sword or shield, I came up with the concept of a rhino shield for a game about 2 years ago, where the shield gave them attributes in the game, but protected one rhino. So why not have fun with it? And I'm passionate about linking the having fun first with your impact, because I think traditionally, it doesn't matter if, environmentally, if you try and push education as part of a game, people sometimes and quite often see it in a negative fashion. So have fun first and make an impact. So it's come from my time in Web3 since about 2017.
Question for you on that, just to dig a little bit deeper, kind of I don't know if aligning of values would be the way to put it, but it sounds like what you were doing is, when it comes to the environmental impact, obviously a lot of people take a very personal view of it, but really it's kind of a global view. It's an overall what's, best for all of us type of view. But it sounds like when you were gamifying the environmental impact, you take it from global to a very personal, here's how this impacts me type of scenario. Am I right to say that?
Absolutely. And one thing that people feel passionately about is impacting their local environments. So it doesn't have to be all about, and the biggest headlines are obviously things like the Congo and the Brazilian rainforest, but you could link to your local, your local park, your local beach, clean up plastic in there. So it's very much about personalizing, what you can do as an individual or a group or a corporation. It's not just individuals, it can be corporations. And that's why I've always been about linking that to an overall picture, so not just about if you're buying something, but where you're going, what you're playing and so on. So if you link it all together, you can add up to a bigger picture.
And so along those lines, you had mentioned earlier that you had, advised and worked with other companies in the Web3 space, specifically on impact. And so what that tells me is that the solution of blockchain, the idea of perhaps healing maybe what we'll call inefficiencies in the carbon markets or impact markets, is not a new idea. Other companies have been doing it. And would you mind expanding a little bit on, I'm using the word inefficiencies loosely, but would you mind expanding a little bit upon what those are?
Well, first thing I will say is ever since the ICO boom of 2017, I think it was, people have realized that blockchain technology in whatever speed can help a lot of industries, whether that's medicine, voting, supply chains, shipping, carbon, charities, another big one. Any industry that is opaque in any way can be helped, or has middlemen in any way, can be helped by blockchain. And the carbon markets and charity is one of those industries where you often get people questioning impact, questioning where the money goes, and so on and so on. So it's not a new concept, but very few things in Web3 are new, because everyone thought about these things when they first heard about blockchain, because blockchain is a peer-to-peer end-to-end solution that cuts out a lot of the inefficiencies, the corruption, and problems you often have in the middle of something. Supply chain's a great example where they're now implementing it. But in 2017, lots of people were trying to create new shipping supply chains. Sometimes ideas are just before their time, or the technology isn't quite there, or the world isn't ready. This is another thing that we have to factor in, is that particularly in the last few years, people have always said, financial institutions are going to get involved, big companies getting involved. But those companies are very traditional. It takes them a long time to change anything internally. And I'm not talking about bringing in revolutionary new or evolutionary technology. It's sometimes 12, 24, even 36 months to bring in a new platform to any large financial corporation. So it's a very slow process. So some of these things that we're talking about are not new in concept, but what potentially can be new is the technology available to execute on some of those, particularly if that doesn't involve any knowledge of what is quite often dimly viewed in the world as Web3. So one of the most powerful advantages of DevvE and what we're offering is the ability to do it easily and seamlessly via the RESTful APIs, and layer essentially on top of what you've already built or what you can build in a Web 2 friendly manner. And Web 2, people talk about Web 2, but I don't think people in Web 2 even say Web 2. It's just, what they do. I mean, Facebook, for example, was, one of the first technically Web 2 platforms, but no one says, oh, great, I'm using the Web 2 Facebook. So people will use things if they're simple and they can work it out. Like PayPal's a great example. I've connected my whole life to PayPal. My addresses, my cards, my bank accounts, they know everything. Do I know how it works? No. Do I know if it's Web 2 or Web 3? Not really. But it works via APIs into other institutions. It works via payment rails. I know that, but it's trusted. So, for me personally, it's about taking what may or may not be a new idea, solving the issues that I think most people by now know are there. I mean, there's been a lot of comments around carbon markets. Is there double counting? Is there greenwashing? Are the baselines inflated? Are these credits even making an impact? Who checks? Yes, maybe they made an impact 10 years ago, but who's checking now? Are those impacts even still valid? You saved a rainforest 10 years ago because someone's going to cut it down. Are those people, have they moved on, or are they still imminently threatening the forest? All of these things are criticisms of the current, either entire or parts of the current carbon markets. We've talked about, you said, is this new? No. People have talked about, let's put credits on the chain. One project, for example, tokenized retired credits at one point, selling them for hugely inflated prices, saying that they were offsetting the world and saving the world. Incorrect. Other people have, are trying and have tried to enter the carbon markets. They've tried carbon exchanges. I was the first, for example, to link carbon credits to an NFT. I think it was in 2020 or 21. I can't remember the exact date. So people have tried different things, but ultimately it's about engagement from both the market and the corporates, because I could build the best marketplace in the world and the most transparent marketplace in the world, but if no corporates trust it, they're not going to buy anything on it. And the vast, vast majority of the carbon markets are driven by corporates, either because they are obliged to, because they've got net zero targets, or because they are pressured to by their users. So they want to buy these things, but they also want to know now that some of the challenges I've just been discussing are being addressed.
Okay, and I want to pick into that a little bit further, kind of making the assumption. So let's assume I'm coming in and I know nothing about carbon markets or, not to use the term incorrectly, but ESG type of stuff. Only what I've heard in the news. I don't watch the news, so that's not a risk. But let's say I did. I assume X is where I get everything. But so this space exists. And these carbon credits are put, they're put into markets and they represent 1 ton of carbon, right? And then these companies, they come in and they purchase these as a way of staying under their carbon caps. Am I correct in saying it in that way?
Yes. Well, one thing I'd probably mention before we get into that is there are 2 carbon markets in effect. There is the voluntary carbon market, which you just mentioned, and then there's which is unregulated, and we'll talk about that later. But then there's the regulated compliance carbon market, which is a cap and trade market, which is essentially where industries get a quota. So if you're, for example, a car manufacturer, you will get a quota that, and you're given your size, you say, okay, Austin Motors can emit 20 tons of CO2 a year, and that is it. You cannot emit more. That market is where those companies then trade those quotas. So if, for example, you emit 18 tons, great, you've got 2 tons you can sell someone else. That's a cap and trade market. That's regulated, and that's a huge market. I think that's around $800 billion because industries are massive. We know that. What has grown very, very fast in the last couple of years is the voluntary carbon market, which is essentially exactly what you said. A project comes along and says, well, hang on a second, we can reduce emissions or absorb carbon from the air of 20 tons. So we're going to sell you, Austin Motors, 20 tons to help you hit your net zero goal. Because yes, you're emitting 18 tons, but you've told the world that you want to be net zero, because emitting 18 tons is still bad. So you have to then buy 18 tons from someone that's proven that they've taken 18 tons out of the air or they've reduced emissions from some other process by 18 tons. That is the voluntary carbon market. That was pretty small until a couple of years ago, $40-50 million, nothing really. It's grown. Last year, I think it hit about 500 to a billion, and it's due. Morgan Stanley and others are estimating by 2030, it's going to hit between 50 and 100 billion. Because as companies drive towards net zero, they are in reality going to have to buy more and more of these credits. And that is exactly what we're saying. But you're fundamentally correct. Each credit almost always represents 1 ton, and you will account for it against your own emissions.
So I want to lead us into a conversation about greenwashing. But before we get to that, so we spoke of cap and trade, right? You stay under your cap, you can trade, as the name would imply. But when it comes to carbon offsets, those are generated in different ways. And I know that you touched on them. You'd mentioned, okay, you're saving a rainforest, you quantify that, sell it on the voluntary market. With such a rapid expansion, there's obviously going to be new creative ways being come up with to generate these carbon offsets. Can you speak a little bit about kind of what those look like?
Absolutely. First thing I would say is you're absolutely right. People assume that, or lots of people assume that carbon offsets or credits, or that there's a slight difference between offsets and credits, but they're generally interchangeable expressions. But carbon credits are created in the same way. There are, in fact, many, many different ways you can create them. Forests grab the biggest attentions, and REDD+, which is a term that lots of people have probably heard, is a big one because that essentially pays countries to not cut down their trees. Because actually, forests absorb a lot of carbon, but cutting them down releases a huge amount. So, perhaps hypocritically, Europe and some other parts of the world have already cut down their forests. People forget that actually the US and Europe both were heavily forested areas before industrialization. And 95 to 98% of European forests have already been cut down. So if the whole world does that, the amount of carbon released into the air is going to be, we're going to go past the tipping point of the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius target that we've got. So people, in one sense, can be paid to not cut down trees. And that is called REDD+, essentially. And that is reducing emissions, because if you cut them down, you're going to emit into the air. So by not cutting them down, you're reducing it. And you can prove that. But there's other things like reforestation. That is where you plant trees. And incidentally, trees are not the only things. You can plant seagrass in the ocean. You can sea kelp, for example. And actually the ocean, you mentioned one of the ways, but actually one other thing that people don't realize is the ocean is an incredibly important part to fight climate change. And in fact, absorbs more carbon than the land. So you've heard about the Amazon rainforest, you've heard about the Congo rainforest, and we absolutely cannot cut those down. But actually what's forgotten about is that there's more carbon stored and more carbon absorbed in the ocean. It's around, it's more than 50%. And a lot of these things grow in the ocean faster than on land. So sea grass, sea kelp, all of these things can be actually used in the fight against climate change. And those aren't necessarily the same carbon credits. Those are now called blue carbon, because it's to do with the management of your coastal, your tidal and semi-tidal regions. So you can, not trawl fishing, for example, with machines releases a huge amount of carbon because it cuts into the ocean bed and it releases the carbon. Incidentally, carbon is not the worst greenhouse gas. It gets the most attention, but actually methane released into the atmosphere is somewhere around 30 times worse than carbon. So whenever you create a methane leak, it's actually very, very destructive. Carbon gets the headlines because it's the biggest, but it's not the most destructive. So when people, and the ocean actually can release quite a lot of methane in the wrong instance. So what we're doing in the ocean is actually as important for climate change as anything. And yes, it can be done. You can create credits that people use for offsets in a number of different ways. And I'd probably finish with, in a lot of these spaces, it's new, or relatively new. REDD+ is relatively new, still finding its feet. ITMOs, which is a new article under the Paris Agreement, allows people to internationally transfer mitigation outcomes. So if as a country, you're producing too much, because every country has to have a nationally defined contribution. And if you think, I'm going over that, and another country is under, you can actually trade that now. But again, no rigid framework in place. That offers DevvE and our platform a huge opportunity to add the trusted data layer of those, because the old way of creating credits is fairly manual and very lengthy and paper-based. It's MRV, it's monitoring, recording, and verification. You go, you survey something, you write it down, someone checks it, someone audits it, and so on. We're able to put all of those now into DMRV, to make it digital. In extreme cases, we can connect directly to the sensors. So for the first time, you can get a real-time position. It's not new what we're talking about. You can create them in a number of ways, but the new ways potentially make these things cheaper, faster, and more impactful to both the environment, but also the people creating them. Because one of the other criticisms is that the people on the ground often don't share the revenue of sold credits. They're either taken by middlemen, forward funders, or people further up the chain. So these can be impactful for both the environment and the local population.
So I want to touch on real quick along those lines, just to kind of tell the story. Greenwashing is a big criticism, not of, well, I guess it could be of the industry, mainly of the individual companies. I remember seeing an article a while back, and I want to preface this by saying, unfortunately, in our country, and maybe other countries, I don't know, there seems to be a partisan rift around this, and I just want to get that out of the way now. But I remember seeing an article saying, there was a climate conference going on where 250 people flew their private jets in to attend this climate and that's where kind of the criticism came in. But so greenwashing is the practice of companies who either implicitly or explicitly make the claim that they're having a net neutral or positive impact on the environment, when the reality is, if we really drill into it in a granular fashion, we find out they're not having the environmental impact that they're professing to have. Am I accurate in saying it in that way?
That's exactly what greenwashing is. There was an article here in the UK of a large, and I won't mention any names, but a large investment bank who's made a huge play on sustainability, net zero. And last year alone, they invested $18 billion into fossil fuels, and essentially projects that are doing the exact opposite of what they're saying. So greenwashing is real. There's no point sweeping it under the carpet. There have been I won't mention names, but there's been very high profile cases of greenwashing. Yeah, we're great over here, but when you dig down, actually not so great, and actually openly, in some cases like this bank, openly supporting destructive, gas emitting projects. So greenwashing is real. The other item that is very, very real is double counting. So the same companies claiming the same environmental benefit from the same credit, because they have been, and obviously the digitalization can help this, they have been sold and resold a number of times. In fact, when I first entered the space, I remember estimates saying that the same credits had been, the average selling was 8 times the same credit. So you had one environmental impact and 8 different companies claiming that they had, the benefit of that impact. That is being very, very, closely dealt with now, because, there are, Vera is very aware of that and so on. But double counting and greenwashing are and have been very real issues. Of course, what we're talking about, and the blockchain, instantly, you mentioned it before, instantly the blockchain can alleviate those issues, neutralize them, because of, and hopefully everyone understands this, but of the transparency and the provenance of being on the chain immediately. And I'm talking, incidentally, in a digitally native fashion. I'm not talking about tokenizing something at the end, because you mentioned originally what other people had done. The initial rush in the carbon market was to tokenize existing carbon credits to prove the origin and the buyer. And whilst that, gets rid of the double counting issue, it actually doesn't change the fact that you have no idea how that credit was created and what impact it's making. So I'm talking about the full end-to-end digitally native creation of a credit. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just a credit. You've got RECs, which are renewable energy certificates, RRUs, which are the RED Plus units that people sell. So it's not just credits, it's everything. Every impact asset you can come up with can be created in a much more digitally native and transparent manner that allows you not only to know where it's come from and who's bought it, but actually what the impact's been. Because there was a very high profile case in the UK where a company was getting subsidized for being sustainable because they were burning wood chips in their power stations instead of coal. Great, it's less pollution. But actually, when they dug into it, they were cutting down a forest. They were actually actively cutting down the forest to create these wood chips. So a primeval forest. So one of the oldest forests around was being cut down, and they were getting paid to do it. So if you just looked at the end state, great, you're reducing your emissions, great, you guys are great. But if you dug into it, they were actually being incredibly destructive, both from a carbon side and a biodiversity side. So you have to look at that whole end-to-end cycle in these davvs.
So you're bringing up some powerful points that actually just connected something really important for me, because I've been learning as you talk. I've heard Davin and Ray and yourself say multiple times aligning of values. And as you're speaking, we hear of all these companies, they're doing positive things for the environment, X, Y, and Z. At the end of it, there's always a financial component that is driving it, whether it's positive marketing or whether it's whatever the case may be, right? In the case of the wood chips, you just mentioned positive marketing, and they're getting paid over here to do so. And so it sounds to me like, to actually attack the problem at its head, we've got to align these values in some way, shape, or form to get people to say, okay, well, it's actually more profitable for me to actually do it correctly than to not. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely right. And that was one of the fundamental principles around the RED Plus program, was that actually it's more profitable and beneficial for you to not cut down these trees. And there's 3 main drivers of deforestation, two of which people might not know about. I mean, the beef industry and palm oil are the two biggest drivers of deforestation globally. So people have this assumption that because these forests are mainly now in developing worlds, that actually people are just going in to cut them down to increase their livelihoods and so on, which does happen. But the two biggest drivers are, the beef ranches and palm oil. 50% of Borneo, for example, has been cut down purely for palm oil plantations, for no other reason, because palm oil is found unbelievably in 2/3 of supermarket product. It's an unbelievably used oil. I don't know why. It's something that you don't even need to use, but 2/3 of products in the UK in supermarkets have palm oil in, which is unreal. I mean, you wouldn't even make that up. So there's huge drivers around this, and you're absolutely right. You have to align those values, because in many instances, it is more beneficial, not just from the environment, but financially, to not destroy these environments. And it's not just forests. As I said, it's every other kind of biome and habitat. It could be anything. So you're absolutely right. Some companies will only ever buy them because they have to. But if that is the case, you can still drive value to them, because you can give them premium credits. You can give them gamification around the credits. You can give them a dashboard that shows not only them, but their stakeholders, their exact impact, both in terms of environmental and location, and biodiversity. You can track actual animals. So yes, some of them might do it just because they have to, and they've set net zero goals and so on, but you can still make a premium experience for those and add value for those institutions.
And I've heard Ray say on a number of occasions, it's okay to do well while doing good, or doing good while doing well. I probably butchered what he said. Whatever, it's okay. I want to pull us back. You had mentioned other chains wanting to tokenize these carbon credits, bring them on chain, but it still leaves us with the unfortunate Genesis issue of we're relying on, Vera and Gold Standard for the certification. So there's still a large amount of trust having to be put into humans for, the provenance of or the actual environmental impact of these credits. And I'm wondering how the solution that we're proposing mitigates that. And do we become enemy number one of these certification companies, or do we become, sort of working together with them?
We don't become enemy number one of certification companies, because ultimately what they do, you're referring to the registries there, is that correct? Like the Vera and the Gold Standards.
Exactly,
so
yeah.
What they do is just verify essentially that you've done what you were supposed to do. There's a methodology to create these things and you followed it. So we're not necessarily the enemy of them. I would say, though, that we are the enemy of certain unscrupulous project managers in the space that have been taking advantage of local populations, because historically, and there's no secret around this, actually creating a project hasn't been cheap. So particularly at scale. So you could be looking anywhere between $500,000 US to $2 million to start a carbon credit project, Red Plus, whatever you want to call it. Do local populations have that kind of money? No, they do not in the vast majority of cases. So what has been happening, and I mentioned these middlemen before, is that these things are often forward funded or pre-purchased, whatever you want to call it, at very unfavorable terms. And in certain cases, I've seen as low as $2 a ton, so the people on the ground get $2 a ton, but then the project manager's selling them for $20 a ton, and in some cases even more. So we will be, if you want to label it like that, we will be the enemy of projects like that, because they, and Davin said it on a previous call, some people don't like transparency. Some people actually lose out when industries are made more transparent. Shipping's another great example. There will be people that lose out when the billing of ships is end to end. There will be people that lose out, and there will be people that don't like it. When that isn't the registry, the registries are hesitant to change from because they've set this process up. It's been running 20 years. They need to see that it works, and they need to see that it isn't just a scam or unregulated nonsense that has happened in certain industries. So they won't be the enemy, but absolutely there will be people that lose out from doing it better.
Now, where we left it off, we had talked about a lot of greenwashing, but where we were moving into was alignment of values, kind of making it more profitable in a sense to do good as opposed to doing bad. And I know that we had discussed a little bit about the DevvE solution, and I'm interested to know, from your perspective, how does DevvE, to use, I don't know if this is a dirty word or not, but I'm going to use it. How does DevvE actually make it more profitable to do good as opposed to not doing good? Does that make sense, Duncan, what I'm asking?
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense. And I think that, the case in point, which I think we touched on last time, is that, the REDD+ program was designed to do essentially that. So nations have forests and they will receive payments to not cut it down, essentially. So, and that's designed to reward them for all aspects of conservation and regeneration and so on. So, and I think that there are many revenue streams from not just forests, but other areas of biodiversity that can be tapped into. You've obviously got ecotourism, you've got renewable energies, and so on. We talked about, the two major drivers of deforestation are the beef industry and palm oil. But that on that side, that is a consumer behavior. Those drivers will not decrease until demand for beef and demand for palm oil either decreases or vanishes. And what we have seen is that it's easier for these countries to sell, or even sometimes illegally, the areas get removed or cut down, and palm trees or palm oil trees are planted, which offer little to no biodiversity gains. They are really one species habitats normally, as opposed to obviously the forest, which is by far holds by far the most species on land. So we can come up with ways to not only make it profitable, but link it into the wider solution. So one thing that we're very keen on is linking all of our programs into an overall sort of data resiliency package. So if the disaster hits, you'll still be able to recall your data, you'll still be able to make communications, you'll still be able to run your hospitals. And that's no different for, one of the streams is obviously an end-to-end environmental solution. So you are able to monitor everything, you're able to report everything, and you're able to monetize it. And that can come in the form of many things. It can be exports, ecotourism, carbon credits, biodiversity credits, which are now coming in. So as a way of also saying, well, hang on a second, you're also removing carbon, but you're also enhancing biodiversity. So you're not just planting trees, there are more animals there, and so on. So there's lots of revenue streams that can be opened up in these areas.
So very interesting, though, and it kind of like gives me the notion that there's so much nuance with every little area that can potentially be, brought into this space. I mean, you're talking about, now when you talk about cows, I think about that old ad back in the day that said too many cows in California were farting, and that's why we have global warming. And I don't think that's true, but maybe that's true. I don't know anything about cows. However, I can see how within all the nuance of this, it can get sticky. Like it can get to the point of people potentially signing off on things that maybe should not have been signed off on. And I'm wondering, so we had talked about provenance. We had talked about not tokenizing the carbon credit at the end of the cycle, but tokenizing it at the beginning of its life cycle. Can we dig into that just a little bit more, how that works?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and you touched upon it there, one thing that continues to happen even now is that governments in forested nations are selling off large tracts of land to the beef industry, to the palm oil industry. Even recently in a country, I was reading about the largest deforestation program has just been agreed, and it's in the tens of thousands of kilometers. It's a very large area. So that was, I believe, in Indonesia. The Congo last year, they put out an auction for, I think it was in the millions of hectares of their forest. So these areas are still, despite the fact that everyone knows the problems with climate change, everyone knows the drivers around net zero and nationally defined contributions and so on, which are at national level. But governments that own these, or some governments, that own these forests, are still selling them, potentially, not all of them. And that is largely to these industries. Not always, but a lot of the people that were bidding for example, in the Congo, I believe, were oil companies. Sometimes they do add on stipulations around the sale and so on and so on. But ultimately, these forests are being sold to be cut down. They're not being sold, for example, for someone to create an ecotourism center or someone to create a sanctuary, by and large. Very, very seldom they're purchased for that reason. But what can be done potentially, as you said, is tokenizing every aspect of that area. And it's not just the carbon credits. It's everything within it. You mentioned, obviously, cows. Methane's a very destructive gas as well. But, the carbon capture can be tokenized. The trees themselves can be tokenized, the nature. But by doing that at the every step of the way level, so not just saying, okay, well, here's a REDD+ credit, we'll tokenize it and we'll prove that you made it and these guys bought it. You can connect a platform or the DevvE's platform to sensors. You can connect it to Google and Bing, who are already creating very, very good satellite imagery of the world that talks about vegetation indices, that talks about soil temperature, that talks about biomass. It's already being monitored on a global level. If you then layer that into additional IoT sensors and potentially some LiDAR scanning, if that data is all coming into a source directly and being recorded at the source immutably on the chain, then you've immediately got a much more trusted and transparent set of data. Because ultimately, any system is garbage in, garbage out. And this was one of the initial problems with tokenizing anything, is that if you tokenize something that's fundamentally flawed, it offers no actual benefit in reality. Because, and that's one of the biggest overall concerns of the entire carbon market, is that actually, is it doing as much good as people claim? Are we actually helping to reverse or help the 1.5 degree target? Are more, endangered species thriving? Are we stopping the hunting of critical animals in the habitat, such as forest elephants? Forest elephants, as an example, play a pivotal role in the rainforest in the Congo with the way that the impacts they have, for example, on the forest. And, I read, for example, a report that if you removed the forest elephants from the Congo completely, it would stop raining in parts of Africa because of the way the whole weather systems work and the carbon being absorbed and moved around and so on. So individual species, particularly the apex predators, which are being removed around the world, are very, very important for whole ecosystems. And sometimes ecosystems collapse when you take away the apex predators at the top. And humans have, throughout history, done that and continue to do so. We are at the point where now we are able to input all of these things. There's been advances in audio sensing, IoT sensing, LiDAR scanning, biorhythmic LiDAR scanning. As I said, Google and Bing both now offer you the ability to zoom into an area in squares of around 30 centimeters to a meter long, giving you a lot of that data. A few years ago, this was all paper-based. You'd have to go field studies. You still need field studies, of course, but you can do all of this now with technology and get it to a point where you as a project manager, or you as an auditor, or you as a verifier, or you as a registry, or you as a UN body can click a button and see all of that data, where it's, the provenance, basically, where it's come from, what area, what good it's doing, and ultimately why we should care. What carbon is being stored or reduced, emissions being reduced. Other greenhouse gases as well, we have talked about that. It's not limited to carbon. Methane, which is a much more destructive gas, as I mentioned, that also can be monitored. And actually, one of the dangers of ice melting is methane being released, that's being captured, and carbon as well. But large areas of methane are coming up now out of the sea that weren't previously locked in, and that's a very, very destructive. It takes much longer for methane to be removed. So it is a combination of everything, but we have now the ability to do that from a technology point of view that previously we didn't, but whilst always connecting it to the key factors for a nation, which is revenue generation and social inclusion, effectively, because the people on the ground are the people actually creating the benefit. They're the ones saving the animals. They're the ones preserving the forest, potentially from illegal poaching or illegal logging. Rangers, for example, play a pivotal role in conservation are very often overlooked from funding point of view. It's a dangerous job. You might have heard, several rangers, for example, get murdered in Africa each year because organized crime is a big element in this. Rhino horns, they are valuable, and they're up to $10,000 sometimes at source. They sell for millions, obviously, in foreign markets. That's very tempting for locals. So it's about giving options to both local people and local governments, bodies, however you want to call it, and proving it. And the end-to-end flow is really the only way that you can increase that trust that brings in the private sector to this, because they all want to hit net zero goals. So they are then confident they're hitting the goals. There's no greenwashing, there's no double counting, and they can tell everyone about it. And they can also click a button and tell people, we've done this, this is our impact. Oh, and by the way, all of these local populations are benefiting to the tune of X, Y, and Z as well.
So just to recap that a little bit, because there was a lot we just talked about. Not only does it become better for the indigenous people of the land, but it becomes better for the governments as well, because not just from a financial standpoint, but also from a look at what we're doing type of goodwill marketing standpoint, it seems to be available to them. And my question to you is, as you're describing all of this technology, and I'm thinking to myself, well, without the new advancements in technology, all of this sounds like either it can't be done, or if it could be done, it takes a ton of manpower. And I'm guessing that's where the quote unquote middlemen played a role, that we're taking a big chunk of this. Am I accurate in saying that or no?
Yeah, so a couple of things I'll pick up on there. I mean, carbon credits have been done historically. The last 20 years, people have been creating carbon credits under the Verra methodologies, the gold standard methodologies. It is possible to create anything that is effectively a workflow. Someone comes up with a methodology, you follow it. Historically, or previously to sort of new technology advancements, that would require much more manual intervention, much more paper-based trail, a lot of Excel spreadsheets, a lot of parts in the chain that can be corrupted, altered, and so on. The middlemen are involved in that stage, but I think the key way that middlemen negatively impact the whole market is by siphoning off the funds at the middle level. As we talked about before, historically, it's been very expensive to set up a project for the reasons I just mentioned. It's very labor intensive. You've got to get verifiers in. You've got to have field surveys, and as I think I mentioned before, projects were quoted millions of dollars just to set up a project. And, local populations and or local governments don't have that kind of money. And even if they did, they wouldn't be willing to put it up because it's a risk. They want the return instantly, and carbon credits can be at 2 to 5. Well, most carbon projects are 20, 30 years, but initially it's 2 to 3 before you even start seeing any return. So the middlemen have been involved very much at the getting involved and funding a project, but reaping a higher percentage of the rewards than really they should do. And that leads to sometimes questionably whether the local population have benefited much at all. Nowadays, governments are very, very keen that if you are doing this, the local population benefits. And obviously, everyone does their bit, so there are verifiers, there are auditors, the UN comes in if it's a RED Plus program and does its, survey, technical assessments and so on. Everyone has to be involved, but by doing this, it's faster, easier, and cheaper for everyone to do that essentially is what it boils down to. The other thing that we talked about, which is key to all of this, is that the DevvE's solution offers that in a Web 2 friendly manner. So we're not telling people on the ground, oh, you've got to learn blockchain or you've got to understand Web 3, which is what other people have essentially tried to do. Because as we talked about before, blockchain technology, transparency, immutability is not new. This has been going around since Bitcoin was invented. Bitcoin is a transparent ledger that anyone can see anyone's wallet. This is why it was invented. It was peer-to-peer. The concept's not new, but getting people on the ground to adopt new technologies, particularly when, even the internet is sometimes patchy, is a huge challenge. But one of the really real strengths that we offer is that just do all of this, do what you were doing, but just connect it to our platform in a way that you understand or that 50 million developers around the world already understand. It's not hard to create a platform on the internet. You create it, and then we can overlay it in any way and adapt it to the local situation. I was speaking to one of the UN representatives that they've developed audio sensors that can identify what species are in a forest simply by listening to them. So immediately, if they were connected to the platform, you'd immediately be able to tell when and where and how many animals there were. And I'm talking about the ones that people are vitally important to the ecosystem. For example, jaguars in South America. Jaguars are the apex predator of South America. They're endangered, they're needed. They can be tracked now by their audio. So you don't need to put collars on them necessarily. So there's all sorts of technology that we can use. And that by overlaying it in this, I use the word simplicity. People are already creating programs. There's already project managers out there. There's already people creating these things. We can just overlay on that existing infrastructure and essentially just add value, add the data layer, add the resilient data layer in some areas that are prone to disasters and so on. So that is where the real value add comes from our platform.
That's incredible. I mean, it's so much more in depth than if we're talking to somebody about selling a bottle of wine, right? That's a very simple transaction. With this, there's so much nuance in each of these. And I'm wondering if we could speak a little bit on so I've heard you and Davin talk about real-time environmental data and what that can actually enable. Can we get into that just a little bit?
Well, I've been also talking to Davin, and I think I've used the word real time about 150 million times in my written communication, because ultimately, one of the challenges around, shall we say, traditional methods is that it's not real time. Someone has recorded something, and 15 stages along the way, someone verifies it, and then a registry says, okay, you have actually created a credit. But by then, the data is 2, 3, 6, 12 months old. Is that forest still there? Is the threat gone? Is the threat still there of the people that were going to destroy it? Which is why REDD+ was effectively set up, because it's all about reducing emissions of forests that were going to be cut down. Real-time data, or as close to real-time data as we can get, is super important, because it allows you to say, look, we set these up, and the baseline carbon stocks were, I'm going to make something up, 1 million tons in this forest. And we've worked that out under this methodology. And those methodologies, incidentally, are not things we're coming up with. They're the things that the UN and registries have coming up for years. We're not telling people this is how you do it. The UN has methodologies. The Vera has methodologies. The UN vets REDD+ methodologies that you come up with, because you can actually at national level come up with your own. So we're not saying this is how to do it. You say, okay, so you've come up with 1 million tons as per this, or this methodology. And because we've connected these sensors and or other items, as we've just talked about, scanners and also, networked field surveys via satellite images, but also directly via satellite links. If that's being submitted to the platform real time, in theory, very possibly, anyone at any stage could just click a button on their dashboard, and the dashboard would be permissioned, obviously, or could be permissioned, obviously, to see that not only was this a situation, but this is the situation right now, and potentially whether that's got better or worse, particularly around biodiversity, clearly the number of trees. LiDAR scanning is not, talk about, its expense, and it was pretty expensive originally, but the cost of that is coming down pretty significantly. And you could get to a situation where you almost have, or you could get to a situation, and I've sort of mapped this out in my own head, where you could have a real life living forest, mapped out in terms of everything: carbon emissions, carbon from the country, carbon reductions from the forest, local population, water quality, soil temperature, biochar, carbon stocks, all these things. That could be a real living entity effectively. And then that lends itself to all sorts of other use cases. Obviously, carbon credits and offsetting is one, but you could have that in, as a film set in games, as I mentioned before. You could tokenize the actual assets and sell it to game producers. So for example, people that picked up a tree in real life and planted it, that could actually represent in real time a real life tree. Obviously, trees don't grow from, as they do in computer games, from start to finish in 1 second. But, there are ways that you could link those together. So there's another revenue stream. Why not have, if there's 30 jaguars in an area, and we know where they are and what they're doing and what their identity is, those jaguars could be in a Disney film, for example, and could represent a real life animal, or a game. So there are other revenue streams, and the near real time data aspirations that we hope to implement into these ecosystems is a very real possibility, and only really possible on DevvE due to the technical side that we have discussed previously.
Amazing. And I as you're talking about these, what sound like lateral revenue streams, I want to kind of move us in a direction that I think will probably cap off where we're going with this, which is the Evergreen Fund, which is something we talk about a lot. And I don't want to push you further than you can talk, but I'm hoping we might be able to kind of dance around this a little bit. So people kind of understand the Evergreen Fund is as the name states, an evergreen fund, which invests into ESG related assets or companies that generate these impact assets or lateral businesses, what have you. And as you're talking about this, and I'm kind of getting the idea that, originally I had thought, okay, the Evergreen Fund would invest into other people's companies that have already started. But as you're talking about this, it sounds to me like as we go into these, whether we call them nation states or what have you, and help out with their ESG efforts or their impact efforts, that new lateral businesses may be created as a result of this potentially. And it could be in that direction that the Evergreen Fund leans. Are you understanding what I'm kind of relating to you right now?
And I can't speak for where the Evergreen Fund will go in the future in terms of its investments and its direction. But what I can say is my opinion is that impact assets are going to grow significantly. ESG was a term, as we talked about before, coined fairly flippantly, if I'm honest, around an industry or a financial industry investing in, well, as you said, startups or companies that were doing good in certain ways. And it's not just environmental, it's social and governance and so on. It's supporting local communities. Have you got are you treating your own employees correctly? It's not just environmental, but in terms of impact assets, I believe personally you're right. I think that environmental assets particularly will become big business and can become big business. In the same way that obviously there's a huge financial market. You have all sorts of financial instruments and assets. Of course, the way they're structured are completely different in physical assets and environmental assets. Everyone's talking in sort of Web3 around tokenization, RWAs, and gaming and AI. Forests are an RWA. I mean, people initially started talking about, okay, we're going to tokenize gold, we're going to tokenize shares. But a forest or a waterfall or a volcano or even a group of gorillas, mountain gorillas, those are assets that a country has. If they sell a load of land to an oil company, they get a one-off hit of revenue. Yes, sometimes significant, but the company then normally destroys that forest and there's no benefit to the government from then on. And there's obviously a negative impact on the environment and the local population. These forests as RWAs absolutely can then lead to all sorts of new industries popping up. I've thought of loads that could pop up. People put solar panels on their roofs. You could tokenize, that. I know this is not related exactly to what we're talking about, but that could lead to another industry in terms of selling, you're tokenizing the energy on those. If people put geothermal plants in, again, you could tokenize the RECs coming out of that, then trade them within games. And this is where I think that RWAs outside of financial industry, because obviously they can't gamify anything, but RWAs, I think AI and gaming are the perfect combination because people are most engaged when they're having fun. And whether that's in education, environmental, ESG, whatever you want to call it, I think there will be huge advances in gaming. Obviously, there already are in environmental impact assets. AI is obviously grabbing the headlines, but combinations that use all of that data. And of course, the assets that we bring in terms of the chain, I'm assuming that's a given at this stage. But if you put all of that together, then you've got these unique, potentially, as you said, new industries popping up that can, as you said, help and make it worthwhile to actually not or reduce, shall we say, emissions and or deforestation.
Incredible.
The other thing that needs to happen is emissions need to be reduced at a global level. So it's not just about preservation of the forests and crucially the ocean, which is being destroyed much faster, incidentally, than forests. And it's, as I said in the last episode, it's actually more important than forests to the planet's climate battle, which is actually overlooked by most people. But outside of that, you do have to get pressure and reduce emissions. People have, cars are obviously a huge emitter of greenhouse gases. There's a focus on shifting those to, the ICE vehicles are being phased out. It's now EVs. But it needs to go further. As an example, EVs are not as environmentally great as people think either, because the batteries in EVs currently are pretty destructive in their creation and actually mining. Mining is a very destructive, obviously everyone knows this, but it's a very destructive industry. And actually, the ingredients used in most batteries for electric vehicles come from very, very forested areas, and the Congo is one. I'm talking about the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel. All of these things are actually pretty destructive. So they don't actually emit gases, but the batteries are actually pretty destructive for the creation of which, I should say, it's pretty destructive. So it's about finding the balance of reducing demand. I mentioned cattle already. If suddenly the world ate half as much beef, the climate would be in a much better shape. Or suddenly we stop using products with palm oil, suddenly that's half the battle. So we've got to approach it from both sides. And I think this data, particularly around what the benefits are of certain plants as well, I read at one point that up to 70% of modern medicine is based on plants that are found in rainforests. So, we're also, we're finding new ways that actually these things can help us. That's the same with sea kelp has been recently medicinal values there. So lots of help there, but it has to be a full end-to-end, reducing certain demand. And that in my opinion comes from gamification. People are very set in their ways, and they particularly on the retail side, consumer side, they don't really change their ways unless there's something in it for them. And corporates tend to be the same. Either there's pressure from below or above, government level or their customer level. I think we can, and with this data, I think we can help all of those decision-making bodies, such as the UN, to make better decisions and make more informed choices, because some of those decisions that have been made have been questioned and not followed in some cases, or pushed back. 1 minute we got EVs coming in the UK in 2030, then it's 2050, now it's back to 2030. This doesn't help anyone, because quite apart from anything else, EVs are more expensive to make than a normal ICE car. So in case anyone doesn't know, ICE is internal combustion engine, which basically just means gas guzzlers. So ICE is a bit of a misleading term, but it is essentially that. So, but ICE cars are on the way out. But are they? Because then people keep saying they're going to be here till 2050. So it's about that end-to-end pressure from both sides. And this data will, in my opinion, help that process.
Interesting. And as you're speaking about this, just to, kind of relate a little bit what I've learned here. And so if I think about, human beings as a general, or let's talk about countries for a second. So if we think about a country like a company, and their assets are their land or their indigenous species or what have you, by them working to maintain those things or preventing them from disappearing, they're actually sustaining their own assets. And I start thinking to myself, well, I think you had just mentioned this a little bit, Duncan, that at the retail level or even the company level, folks generally take, I'll use a different word, a more selfish approach. They take the approach that is going to be of greatest benefit to them. And just like with crime, if you come down with regulation, you might get compliance, but within that compliance, people are going to break the rules. And so by us working towards making it actually more beneficial for them to make the right decision, it sounds like we're kind of attacking the problem head on. Was that an accurate statement that I just made?
Yeah, I think you're right. We are allowing that. You're absolutely right in general. Even now, you have a lot of illegal gold mining, for example, in parts of South America in the forest that are sometimes not even nationally reported or recognized. There's claims of, entirely intact tracts of forest, and then when people actually go and fly over them, huge areas have been cut down for these illegal gold mines. And that's I'm not going to sort of get into that side of things, because that is for a number of reasons why those activities are either allowed or ignored or frankly, not resourced enough to combat them. Because where there's, and I think you've alluded to this, where there's money to be made, people will try and make it. I mentioned the illegal, trade in certain things in Africa, rhino horns and so on. It's no different. If people think there's gold in a forest, they potentially, and they have no other means of income, or there's someone paying them to go and get it, they're going to go and get it in many cases. So it is around the holistic approach and giving people the tools to say, hey, look, actually we can protect this and we can use X amount of revenue. Therefore, we can get the security and we can generate X, Y, and Z, or even think about a way of sustainably removing gold or whatever the asset is. You're absolutely right. The assets on and in the ground are really what a country has. Lots of countries, and I touched on this before, lots of countries have already removed or destroyed those assets, including not just trees, but soil, water assets. Water has been greatly reduced. Fresh water has been massively polluted around the world and is actually now in very, very scarce supply. So a lot of the lakes, for example, that people thought were there are now undrinkable. So all of these are natural assets of a nation. You're absolutely right. And I think it's up to us and the people of this generation to come up with ways that we can either sustainably generate the revenue from them, protect them for the good of the climate, because ultimately, if the climate goes wrong in the future, there will be no human race. So it doesn't make any difference what we do, for around the edges. The pivotal time is now. The Industrial Revolution happened, but it's sped up so quickly in the last 20 years, and everyone knows where it's going. But as you said, companies and people tend to do what's best for them, and countries. And in certain cases, completely justifiably so. Because if someone turns around and says, I'll give you $20 million for this patch of land, and somebody else says, don't do that because it's bad for the environment, well, that's not a particularly strong argument to not do it. So it is all around what we can do, how we are affecting it, and ultimately how it's affecting us. The planet will, this is one thing, we talk about destroying the planet. The planet will recover. The planet was hit by a massive, massive meteor that wiped out all of the dinosaurs. It took around 10 million years, but the planet recovered. It did not die and won't die from our actions here. But what might die is us, as the dominant species. In that case, the dominant species, which was the dinosaurs, died out, because of what had happened externally. And we're effectively doing the same internally. So the planet won't die, but we might die. And we're at the point where we have to bring all of this data, all of the technology we have now to help. And that is what we can do at a national level.
Unbelievable. Man, if you don't feel like you're on the bleeding edge of technology here after listening to that, man, you should. Duncan, thank you so much, my friend. For anyone watching, I'll be the first one to admit, I know there's a lot of information to get with DevvE, and I hope you guys consume this information and watch it and rewatch it, because it's going to give you, like, to use Duncan's word, a more holistic view of what we're doing, even though there are many, many different facets to it. Duncan, thank you so much for being here, my friend. Thanks for everyone for tuning in. My name is Austin, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.